Well, good morning and welcome. My name is Deb Atwood. I am the Executive Director of AGREE. Today we're going to share with you our work over the past year and demonstrate our path forward. A year ago we were strangers. We really didn't know one another. The co-chairs, the advisory committee, the foundations, and the Meridian team were all fairly new. And with that, over a year of very intense meetings and discussions, we are here today to talk about what we've learned and where we're going. Following my introduction, you will hear from three of the co-chairs, Dan Glickman, Emmy Simmons, and Gary Hirschberg. Unfortunately, Jim Mosley is sick with a terrible cold and could not make the trip. But he will be sitting on the shoulders of his three colleagues here today as they discuss what it will take to achieve AGREE's vision for 2030. Also, you're going to hear from members of our advisory committee and some invited guests. We have today, joining us is Jeremy and Bala. If you guys can raise your hands, and then I know people can see you. Judith Redman, A.G. Kawamura, Pat O'Toole, Eric Olson, Chuck Benbrook, Johanna Nessa-Tuttle, Rod Snyder, and Barton Seaver. We're going to engage on what our priorities will be over the next 12 months with both the co-chairs and the advisors and guests. We have also developed foundational papers for your information. Copies are in the packets that you have, and they're also going to be online, or they are online now. These documents are door openers. They're not recommendations. They're a set of very, I think, informed issues that are before us. And these papers are related to the challenges that you see up on the screen that we'll talk about today. Our mission at AGREE is to drive positive change in the food and agriculture system by connecting and challenging leaders from diverse communities to catalyze action and elevate food and agriculture policy as a national priority. Our challenges and priorities are displayed. They are also very important to us because the 14 strategies that relate to meeting these challenges are listed here and presented in an integrated way. Our critical challenges include meeting the future demand for food, conserving and enhancing our water, soil, and habitat, improving nutrition and public health, strengthening farms, workers, and communities. Through extensive dialogue this past year with our co-chairs, our advisory committee, our research committee, and other experts, we've developed the comprehensive framework which you see before you. And we've identified a subset of 5 priorities of these strategic areas that we will lead forward on in the next 12 to 18 months to come up with an initial set of policy recommendations. Those 5 are now colored in blue, and they include redirecting research, education, and extension priorities, and strengthening institutions in the United States and developing countries. Questions such as, does the land grant system in the U.S. need overhauling to address the new and changing priorities? 2, ensuring vulnerable populations access to nutritious food. Questions like, should there be incentives and/or limitations on the use of dollars going to federal nutrition programs to encourage healthier food choices? What policy changes and investments are needed to reduce yield gaps and promote access to nutritious food in developing countries? These are the kinds of things we've discussed and debated and sought research on over the past year. 3, aligning agriculture food production in the United States with improved environmental outcomes. What is needed to increase production and reduce post-harvest waste and loss to feed the people that we're going to have to feed in 2050 with no net increase in land or water use? How can policy better enable the use of performance-based environmental standards and provide greater regulatory certainty for producers? Producers have asked us from all the different kinds of systems in the United States, what is it going to take legally to produce food that in fact is complying with the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act? or food safety standards. 4, which is really, I think, been an extraordinary learning experience about creating a stable legal workforce in the food and agriculture system. This is the one issue that's risen to the top of every discussion we've had. How do we create a stable legal workforce in this country? When you think about how big the food and agriculture system is, we're talking $1.8 trillion and almost 9% of the workforce. This is a very important issue that truly needs sectoral attention. Attracting young people to food and agriculture is our 5th priority. We have questions around financial barriers, what are the opportunities, what's working, what's not working, what's missing, to help promote and help young farmers get into the food and agriculture system. So in 2012 and 2013, we'll be digging into these strategies and exploring opportunities, forging consensus among diverse groups. This will include the people who have worked to date, as well as a growing network of partners, and almost all of you are in this room, I think. We are already making solid progress on several of these critical priority issues. As we've said before, we'll not reinvent the wheel, but we intend to amplify the work of others and collaborate with partners to build broader and stronger coalitions for change. We intend to co-convene programs to address these priority focus areas with people across the food and ag system, and forging new and perhaps very surprising alliances. We will be reaching out to institutions and individuals with the relevant expertise and experience. We have been asked about the Farm Bill and our role vis-a-vis this Farm Bill. AGREE was established to work over an 8-year period to develop and advocate for integrated approaches. It was charged with examining not only Farm Bill policies, but Child Nutrition Act, trade, foreign assistance, environmental, and other policies and legislation. For instance, now immigration and banking and finance. As the current Farm Bill is debated, AGREE hopes the priorities of redirecting research priorities, ensuring access to nutritious food, conservation, creating stable and legal workforce, and supporting new farmers are given serious consideration. Many of our AGREE participants are actively engaged in this current Farm Bill process, and we are benefiting from their insights, their work, and their relationships. When we are finished with the 2 panels today, we will be taking questions. The co-chairs will be available to answer those questions. I don't know if there are cards on the table, but if there are cards on the table and you have something that you jogs your mind, please write those questions down, and we will work to get as many of them answered at the end. I am now going to turn the program over to Dr. Duncan. She's our research director of AGREE, and she will facilitate the discussion with the co-chairs. And Mill, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Deb. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you're here. I'm going to talk with Emmy and Dan and Gary about these same 5 priorities. I hope you'll look at all 14 strategies, but we felt we could really move ahead on these 5 in the next short period of time and come up with very specific policy recommendations. And then we're going to work hard to get those policies implemented. I'm going to start by asking each of you why you're working with AGREE and what you think is different about AGREE. Dan, do you want to start?
Well, sure. Thanks, Mill, and thanks to the folks that are here. I am really sorry that Jim Mosley couldn't be here today. I call him the kind of conscience of the group. And he's an active farmer, worked in the previous administration with Deb, has one son who's an organic farmer and one son who's a traditional farmer, and he has peace and harmony in his home. So it shows you that it can work, but he's a great asset. And actually, we are of different backgrounds and persuasions, the NGO world, the corporate business world with a kind of adjunct into progressive agriculture, I guess, if I can characterize you that way, and then it's kind of an old balding politician, and so we're kind of and then a group of advisory committee members that come from different backgrounds, heavily focused on research. So it is kind of an interesting thing, a longer term perspective, especially when we have these foundations funding us, who heretofore, a lot of them haven't been involved in food and agriculture issues. And so we're differentiated in a way that from other people looking at these issues. Yesterday I was watching the C-SPAN debate on the Farm Bill, the Senate Agriculture Committee, and they were doing a very good job at dealing with their amendment processes. And I remember I used to do the same thing, but it was almost exclusively focused on Title I and crop insurance. And that's okay. That's what I did when I was there as well. But there's just so much more to this world. In fact, we found that what we're doing in this area is basically the whole world is involved in issues involving the production of food and related issues to food. And so we're just a much more broad focused area than what we often see on the Hill. But I would just make 5 points, if I might, is why am I in this thing and what are we doing? What are the big things that are causing us to move towards these strategies and mission principles? Okay, principle 1 is demographics. We have population and income levels that are growing dramatically. Whether we're going to need to double the production of food in 30 years, or whether it's going to go up 60% or 80%, we have population and demographic figures, particularly in South Asia and in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we're seeing large income growth, people's dietary patterns are changing. We have to either grow more food on the land that we have or find other ways to do it or distribute it. And that is just a reality of life, and that accompanies everything that we're doing, and most of that's going to be done outside the United States. Number 2 is we have to do it in a way that deals with the reality that we have virtually no new soil and no new water resources to do this incredible thing with. About 75% of the world's fresh water is used for agriculture right now. And with the urbanization of our planet, I guarantee you the pressure will be on there to use less water for agriculture, not more, because people moving into urban areas are not going to want to have to share it in the same capacity. And in that same role, whether you believe that we are in global warming from a cosmic perspective, we are in a period of great climate variability. It's going to impact anybody who produces or consumes food. It's going to have great impact on farmers and ranchers, both here in the United States and in the rest of the world, particularly in drought-prone and desertification-prone areas. And that's a big, big factor. How are we going to produce food with these wild shifts of climate that are taking place? Whether they're short-term or long-term, it doesn't really matter. And so that's the number 2 thing. Number 3 thing is the public is much more interested and focused about what they eat and how the food is grown. That's much more than we ever saw before. Issues like nutrition and health and the public desire to know what is in their food and how it is being grown and whether it is good for them, those are dominant issues now. They weren't 50 years ago. We just trusted the producers of food. If they do it, kind of like from the movie, if they grow it, we will come. And it is different now. And it's accentuated by modern communications technology, social networking, all of the modern ways that people communicate. An issue can become an instantaneous wildfire issue overnight. It doesn't matter what big companies think, or in many cases what the politicians think. If the public gets engaged, they will have great impact on public policy decisions. That is new. That is different. We have to be prepared for that, and recognizing it in the process, folks are going to really want to know more than they do right now about what they're consuming and how it's being grown. The 4th thing is and by the way, that gives average people a lot more political power. It's an antidote, quite frankly, for traditional political power that we see in this world. And it's going to affect the food industry very, very dramatically. The 4th thing is political stability. How do these issues impact governance, freedom, economic liberty? Many people believe that the whole crisis involving North Africa, the Arab Spring, was in large part caused by resource challenges. Tom Friedman has talked about this many times in his column. It's water, food, air, and price associated thereby. And so these issues are going to rather dramatically impact the future of governance throughout the world. And my fifth point, which all of us, I think, have made as we look at all these issues, is that when I was in the House on the Agriculture Committee, I see my friend Charlie Stenholm out there and others, when I first got to Congress, being on the House Agriculture Committee was not necessarily the most sought-after committee of the world unless you came from a farm country. And in fact, it was often viewed as well, if you become we'll see how you do if you can move off the Ag Committee. And today we're beginning to realize that it is not only one of the most important of all committees, but that food and agriculture are being elevated to the same level of importance as healthcare, national security, energy security. It's no longer just parochial issues that farmers and their allies on Capitol Hill do to work on specific program crops or program areas. In some respects, that's threatening to the folks who have been in this world for a long time, but it shouldn't be, because now we're seeing these issues are viewed as more important than they ever were before. They get their place in our national debate as they ever did before. Did you ever hear about a president mentioning food and agriculture issues in the State of the Union message before? Rarely is it ever done. And so all this is good, but it scares the status quo a little bit. And it means there are more hands mucking around in what we're talking about today. And we have to relish that. We just have to hope that the facts and the science are good, and we're going to do our best to try to make sure that that is in fact the case. But we can't be afraid to go into this new era when the issues are much more important and much more highlighted than ever were before. And I think that's where AGREE can help pull a lot of these issues together, build some commonality, and move the debate forward. So
Thanks, Dan. Yeah. Great. Emmy, do you want to talk about your view of how we're different and where AGREE is going in these times and contexts that Dan mentioned?
And I'll just pick up on a couple of issues that Dan mentioned. The importance of food and agriculture, couldn't agree more. But I just want to add the note of urgency. The fact is that we're at a point now where, as Dan said, we don't have many more natural resources, but we do have a lot more people. In the next decade, just 10 years, by 2022, 242 million more people will be living in sub-Saharan Africa and requiring more food. To me, that really kind of puts a challenge out there for all of us, that in fact, we're seeing that demographic change and we're seeing it come really fast. So some of the themes that we're going to be talking about, youth, employment, stable workforce, some of the political issues that Dan talked about, they're not only sort of just out there in a theoretical way, but we need to deal with them on an urgent basis. So personally, I've spent my entire career working on food and agriculture issues in a development context, working internationally, most of it in Africa since 1969. And the opportunity to join the AGREE team, to me, was just an opportunity I could not resist, because it gave me a chance to participate in a really collaborative effort to put domestic issues on food and agriculture in international challenges on food and agriculture within the same framework. And that, as all of you who work in Washington know, is very difficult, because domestic issues and foreign issues are kind of put on sort of two sides and rarely joined together. So what's different about AGREE as it has evolved in this last year is that I think the conversation has been a diverse conversation. As you'll hear in talking to the Technical Advisory Committee, people are coming from very different places, both in terms of their experience and what they expect to accomplish and what they want for their kids for the next generation. But everyone on the AGREE team, I believe, is really committed to the notion that we have to sort of focus in on the evidence. We have to focus in on science. We have to focus in on the realities, the facts about food and agriculture, and proceed with our conversation in a fairly objective way. And again, for those of you who've worked in different areas of Washington, you often find that, you know, there's this group that thinks this and that group that thinks that, and everybody advocates their own position. In the Agree approach, the idea is that everybody advocates their own position, but we try to come together on a common ground in order to define and address the common purpose, which is to come up with food and ag policy and practices that will actually address the challenges that we've put forward. So to me, it's an ambitious agenda, it's an ambitious approach, but I think it's one that can change both the tone but also the content of the conversation about food and agriculture.
Thank you so much. Gary, what have you seen this last year, and why are you
Well,
on
I'm
this
going to
team?
confirm. I'm going to agree with everything that my colleagues have just said. For
We agree.
starters, I think that's an important, maybe starting point in a hyper-partisan town and a hyper-partisan divided country. That this is not a partisan issue. I know how things work here. I'm not being Pollyannish, but we all eat, and we all have these concerns, and we're all living in a place of diminished resources and skyrocketing population pressures, not just in numbers, but as was mentioned, in the kind of quality of life that the rest of the world is seeking, and we're seeking here. Food is healthcare. I think we're finally understanding that in this country. It's how we eat does determine the nature of our healthcare and does determine our national bills. For the cheapest form of healthcare is not getting sick. There's always a tension. I want to pick up on something Dan said, and my goal here is to try to help you all to understand a little bit of the texture of what we're doing, and I maybe want to issue a disclaimer up front, and that is we're just getting started. Where this is I see today as kind of a coming out party. There's been 4 intense meetings. You're about to hear a very interesting cross section of our members, the advisors here. But I promise you, for the 6, 7, or 8 advisors, you have to understand there's 35 or 40 others with equally strong expertise and views. And these 4 meetings have been a lot about listening. Yes, it's been about talking and representing our views, but it's been a whole lot about getting to know each other. And Deb opened up this way. And I can tell you, among the 4 co-chairs, just a tremendous learning curve as we've gotten to know and understand each other. Jim Mosley has discovered I'm not a beret-wearing, Birkenstock-wearing, granola-chewing guy, and I've discovered he doesn't leak chemicals out of his briefcase. And quite the opposite. We've developed an incredibly healthy and deep respect for each other because I think we understand this is about the future. Him as a father and grandfather, me as a father, me as somebody who leads a company with now 500 people in an industry that's been putting on tremendous compounded growth rates. The organic sector is now 6% of U.S. food, $31 billion in sales, but obviously still on the rise and still very young and early in our development. So we're getting to know each other. But there's always a tension, to Dan's point earlier, there's always a tension between what's known, and Dan calls it the status quo, and what's going to be needed or what needs to be known. And certainly, it's well understood in this town how it works. The status quo has established lobbying, established campaign funding mechanisms, has established presence, and then you take a sector like mine, for example, which frankly is a rounding error next to the kind of investments in agribiz. The big problem is that there's often a tyranny of the status quo. And in my world, even within my little world, there's a tyranny. The prevailing wisdom in the organic space has been, keep it small, keep it grassroots, and Trey Bailey's here. I mean, Walmart is one of my most important partners. I promise you, as much as many folks would see me as being sort of out there on the, I guess I'm on the right of this panel, but on the stage, but right. But believe me, it's been a healthy debate inside, and yet Walmart is exactly where we need to be. Why? Because an increasing number of our fellow citizens, that's where they can afford to buy their food. And organic, there's 1,000 reasons to eat organic food. There's one reason not to, and that's that it's too expensive. Now, again, you could talk about the level playing field in terms of subsidies. We don't have the status quo investments. We're not in, I will say the Senate, what came out of the Senate this week we're very pleased with, in that organic was fully funded. But understand, we're talking about this versus this. We're not really in the grab bag game that goes on here. But the important point, and the context for Agree is that this is, we don't have, as Emmy said, we don't have another 40 years to get this right. I say 40 years. I started, my industry is essentially 40 years old. Although, I started my company in 1983, so 29 years ago. We often joke we had a wonderful business back then. We just had no supply and no demand. Now, of course, it's a real industry. You couldn't even use the words organic and industry in the same sentence. But what this discussion is about not necessarily being tyrannized by the status quo, about looking at, from an evidence-based perspective, at whether it's toxins, whether it's water, which was mentioned, whether it's health trends. The President's Cancer Panel indicating 41% of Americans are going to be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetimes. When President Reagan convened that panel, it was 21%. What's it going to be 20 years from now? And they're implicating chemicals, not just in agriculture, but in our modern life. And again, we don't have 20 years to find out epidemiologically later that we messed things up. Climate, we don't have 20, 25 years, 30 years to get this right. We've got to adjust with the best information we have today to what's going on. And that means we have to listen. That means we have to hear different perspectives. That means I have to understand what's going on and you'll hear from Pat shortly, what's going on in big production ranching and with Jim, big production scale cropping, because again, it's volumes, it's wastage, it's efficiency, it's resource being effective with resources. So maybe I'd explain it this way. I wear three hats. Emmy said we each need to be who we are, obviously. But we, as I hope I'm conveying, we need to meld together as we get away from partisanship in addressing these questions. So I just want to underscore, I wear my organic hat, but I'm a business guy. I'm part of the American food system. I am out there competing with plenty of folks on the national and international stage, and that means I'm competing for supply as well. And frankly, my industry, my segment is supply constrained. And I'm an entrepreneur. This is, and I distinguish that from being a business person, because much of what we're talking about is going to entail massive amounts of entrepreneurship when you're talking about enticing young people in. So I joined Agree because I need to be at the table. These views need to be here. But I also know that we have a tremendous amount that we can and must learn from each other because of the time constraints, the urgency that was mentioned. And also because I understand that none of us have all the answers. The organic side doesn't, we have some very compelling data to share, and it comes out of land grant now, and we're showing higher yields, not necessarily in years 1, 2, and 3, and not necessarily with every single crop, but in years 4, 5, and beyond, absolutely competitive, and in fact, better yields. We're showing more carbon sequestration. We're showing better water efficiency. We're showing animal health, dramatic improvements. Organic cows live 2 to 3 times longer than non-organic cows. These data need to be on the table. Not to say this is the only answer, but the evidence needs to be accounted for. And so whether we're talking about climate or toxins or water, again, it's got to be evidence-based. And what I have found, and I'll just maybe wrap it with this, is, as I hope you've gotten a sense, is that thus far in our early coming together, people are here to learn. If any single individual today gives you the impression that we've got it figured out, then you've come away with the wrong understanding. We are asking the deep and hard questions, but we've built a basis of trust. And I know that's probably an odd word in this town these days, but that's what's necessary. And I think we all understand that. The American people understand that. As an example, AG, you'll hear from AG shortly. AG is in the organic and the conventional space. And he'll be the first to tell you, he tried organic, 15 years or so ago? It wasn't working for him. The technology wasn't there. They're back in it now, and there's been advances in 15 years that are really significant, and they're making money. And that has to be discussed. That has to be on the table. Pat, I mentioned, here, I look at, traditionally in my world, there's the bigs and the littles, and you look at the bigs and you say the bigs are, doing something wrong. Pat, there's no one more dedicated to conservation in this room than Pat O'Toole, and many of the colleagues out there who are doing conventional cropping. While we're not here to talk about the Farm Bill, I will say the $6 billion cuts in conservation, I don't know anybody across the Agree that are being recommended out of the Senate. I don't know a single member of the entire Agree family who thinks that's a good idea, regardless of whether they're in corn, soy, or organics. Jim Mosley, I already mentioned. Jim's educating me about genetics and engineering and genetic engineering, and I'm educating him about organic crop rotation. And this is what we've done thus far. These strategies, and as Mill said, there's a bigger subset. But by identifying these 5 and focusing on this as our focal point for the next couple of years, I think you can get a sense of these are enormous. Any one of these could take us the next 8 years. Any one of these. It's a huge undertaking. It starts with trust. It's built on evidence-based thinking, and it's one of the most exciting and important things I've ever been involved with.
Thank you so much.
Mill, can I just mention one other thing, and that is that if you look, I think people have a list of all of our members of our advisory group somewhere, but traditional agriculture is represented in this group. We have representatives from DuPont, Cargill, I'm not sure what other big companies are.
Stonyfield.
Because I think it's clear that we have to say that this is an inclusive process, and because it's not a hell-bent ideological process to produce enemies. Now, as Gary says, it may challenge some of the existing thinking at times, especially if it's based on good science and good data, which is critical for all this stuff. But it is an attempt to be a fair way to do that kind of thing.
Thank you all. I think you can get a sense from that brief discussion of both how we are working and the way it's moving us forward, where we understand each other in new ways. I want to now crisply move through our 5 strategies that we're focused on and give folks an idea of where you guys see the issues and what the questions are, and possibly even the direction you think we ought to go. So let's turn to the reprioritizing of research and strengthening the land grant research and development and extension systems. I guess I'll start with you, Gary, because in your opening remarks were kind of talking about the diversity of systems. But if you, in a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about where we might go and what we need to look at as we look at this strategy. What would you say?
Yeah, it probably seems like a no-brainer to folks that redirecting and enhancing R&D is critical. It is a no-brainer, but it's the how. And this has been, I think there's a broad unanimity across the group that there is no future of food and agriculture without deep investments in R&D. Again, wearing my own hat, in the organic space, we're right now getting about 1.4% of federal research money in R&D, whether it's on crops or animals, and yet I've already mentioned we're about 6% share of U.S. food and growing at about 20% annually right through the recession. So there's this, whether it's public or whether it's private, clearly from where I sit wearing my own hat, this is an area of where we have to ratchet it up. At the same time, again, bringing my own perspective into this, looking at the impacts of toxins, something that we've spent a lot of time on. We've rolled our sleeves up. We've had some real arm wrestling going on here. But I think everybody understands that in a world that is now becoming more and more dependent because of productivity on inputs, we don't, until we have some notion of the cumulative synergistic and synergistic impacts of toxins. We just saw this this bioeconomy blueprint come out this week, which I'll tell you right now is it's a very status quo document out of the White House. It doesn't tend to the enormous number of research mandates, research concerns. I'm not saying answers. I'm saying questions that need to be asked. And so again, there's a broad about, for example, herbicide tolerance, and about now this sort of inflation of herbicide tolerance is happening as we build weed tolerance, and then we bring out the cavalry with stronger inputs. And at the same time, there's the compelling pressure that we've still got to balance all of that with productivity needs and requirements. So this one, it was an easy one to agree on. It's the how. I don't think we're fully there yet. I think the next couple of meetings, this is going to be where we're going to be especially active. But I don't think anybody could dispute the fact that America, in many areas, falling behind in R&D is not in our best national interest, and certainly not in our global interests.
Thanks, Gary. Dan, you're really passionate about R&D and the need for us to focus on that and talk a lot about the meteors coming, what's going to happen now. Where do you see us going with this?
Well, I was at a meeting yesterday. I run a program at the Aspen Institute, and we had a defense expert. And somebody said, well, how are we doing in all of our areas? And the comment was, well, in the area of R&D, we're actually doing quite well. Mm-hmm. We have all the resources we really need. And I'm thinking that in the defense and the NIH area, I mean, do you think we really shortchange our R&D very dramatically in health research and defense research? No, we don't, because we believe it's a national priority. And this is one of the things why I'm interested in the AGREE, because if this is just a parochial food and agriculture effort, we will never elevate the areas of agriculture research to the places they need to be, because it will be viewed as parochial agriculture research. It won't relate to health, to the ability to produce food, the political stability, all the other issues that we talk about. And so, yeah, we need to augment the dollars, but we need to make a hell of a lot better case as to where those dollars are going to be going. Who's going to be doing? Are they public sector dollars or private sector dollars? Are they going into basic research, or are they going into applied research? What's the role of the private sector, which is more and more involved in these research dollars, because the universities need the dollars, and they can rely more on the private sector than a public sector it's been falling in. Maybe we should change the name of the research arm to the National Defense and Agriculture Research Arm, and then we'll get more money in that process. But I think that's one of the things. I just mentioned one thing. When I was on the Science Committee in the House, and I chaired the Aeronautics Subcommittee, and in 1979 I went out to Cleveland to look at the the Lewis National Laboratory on wing composites and wing design, and then I came back there 12 years. I met the same professors, and they're doing the same work 12 years later. And it struck me that I get a sense that there is a lot of that in the agriculture research world. I'm not saying it's universal, but I'm just saying that the funding systems and the nature of who does the research and how and when means they're not as flexible to deal with the modern problems that we've talked about. So we at AGREE need to look at not only the dollars, but how it's being done. What's the role of the land grant system and their relationship with the private sector? Who does what better? Because we've got to have both applied research and basic research in order to deal with these things. And second of all, there's just a whole lot of greater interest by the public in areas on nutrition and health. And it's not just what you grow, it's what you eat. Mm-hmm. And so I suspect that we have kind of underfunded and underfocused on those particular areas. As Gary talked about, we have 90 million Americans who are in a pre-diabetic situation in this country. So, and that's replicated 10 times worldwide. So, you know, and the cacophony of information out there, the public, about what's good for them and what isn't, and how it changes all the time, and a lot of the allegations are not based on good science at all. I mean, there is an area that just requires a massive effort, and it ties the production of food to the consumption of food, and I don't think that we do enough in that area as well. And I think that, and finally, I go back to the situation, we are going to have to produce more. And farmers are going to have to produce more using less water, less inputs, and doing it in a more environmentally sustainable way. That's going to require a lot of additional research that we're not really doing right now. And how we do this is something that is to prepare ourselves for what I call the asteroids that are coming. The asteroid might be a real asteroid, but more likely it's going to be a drought for a period of years, a pest or a disease that wipes out one crop, particularly a crop that doesn't have a lot of genetic diversity to it. And we just have to be prepared for that kind of stuff, and I don't think we are right now.
Thanks, Dan. Emmy, I want to switch now to our priority about ensuring access to nutritious food for vulnerable populations, and ask you to, from your perspective, working in the developing world, what are the issues that AGREE is going to face trying to come up with real recommendations, including about research on that issue, and how is ensuring access to nutritious food linked to health in the areas that you know well?
Set of complex questions.
I know, I've bunched a bunch.
It may be useful first to define what we mean by vulnerable populations, because there were some questions in a conversation earlier about, well, exactly how do you define vulnerability? And I think that perhaps the easiest way to do that is to say that vulnerable populations are those, in this context, that are food short and are generally malnourished, either undernourished or with the wrong balance of nutrients in their diet. And these two characteristics lead to a heightened risk of ill health and, in many cases, death. So that's kind of the definition of the vulnerable populations. We have vulnerable populations in the United States, and as everyone knows, the data internationally indicate that nearly a billion, between 800 and 900 million people right now are considered to be vulnerable in those senses of having food shortage, facing food shortages and being malnourished. But it's also important to consider vulnerability along a time scale, because there's short-term vulnerability when there's, for example, in the case of Syria right now, people are being displaced. They don't have access to food, their normal supply chains are broken, they perhaps don't have enough cash in their pockets. There's an emergency situation. Somalia, another emergency situation. So there's a short-term vulnerability that we have to be concerned with. But there's also long-term or chronic vulnerability. People who consistently, day in and day out, do not have enough to eat, are not able to access those additional supplies of food and or nutrients that they need. And those folks are vulnerable too. But the mechanisms to address short-term vulnerability and long-term or chronic vulnerability are actually quite different. Experience tells us that to actually ensure that the most vulnerable, those who could be the least healthy, be at most risk of death, need some kind of an access to a safety net. In the United States, the safety net portion of the Farm Bill funding is by far the largest segment of the funding. Perhaps Title I gets more discussion, but in fact, the safety nets, the food safety nets, the food nutrition safety nets are actually the major budgetary commitment. And the safety nets in the United States are set up in a way to be somewhat flexible, that is, addressing both short-term needs as well as long-term and chronic needs. But the question is whether, in fact, there is enough effort being placed to address the underlying issues which cause people to be chronically vulnerable to ill health, bad nutrition, and other kinds of illnesses and diseases. Internationally, we actually have to be a lot more careful about design of safety nets, just because the safety nets are so much smaller and so much thinner. The World Food Program, the Emergency Food Aid Programs very much try to target those who are vulnerable to in the short term. That is, that they're affected by flood, by conflict, by displacement in some way, and that the food gets to that population in order to prevent mortality. However, there is increasingly learning that long-term vulnerability, chronic vulnerability, is perhaps a much bigger challenge and cannot be addressed with the same mechanisms that are used to address short-term vulnerability. And I think that this is a question that, as we talk about addressing the nutrition needs of vulnerable populations, we're going to have to get beyond the safety net approach. Because it may be that, in fact, addressing income issues, addressing employment issues, and in many cases, addressing agricultural productivity issues is going to be the critical mechanism for dealing with long-term chronic vulnerability. So there are different mechanisms to do and different tools to address the nutrition needs of vulnerable populations. The mechanisms that we use need to be more closely monitored and evaluated with regard to effectiveness. And I think we've also learned that there has to be some flexibility to change. Right now, there's a great deal of challenge to the status quo in terms of, for example, the way that US food assistance is delivered internationally. I suspect that there's probably some challenges within the United States with regard to, and there will be, as you were talking about the budgetary pressures on the food and nutrition assistance programs, that there will be some efforts to look at the effectiveness of those programs and to use some flexibility and redesign. So these are some of the questions that I think AGREE is going to need to address, trying to figure out which is the appropriate way forward. I don't think we have the answers yet, but we certainly have started that conversation.
And let's have one last round now about the kind of linking this, our interest at AGREE in attracting young people into the food and agriculture sector, and finding a way to ensure a stable and legal workforce in the extended food and agricultural sector. And maybe I'll start with you, Gary, at Stonyfield. I'm sure you think about that next generation, and also the farmers that are supplying you are looking for workers.
Well, let me start with AGREE, even more than Stonyfield. This has been a powerful discussion for us in these 4 meetings. The pressures on farmers and farm communities here, there's all these pressures with workman's comp issues and so forth and so on. Traditional, I mean, in my state of New Hampshire, you could always get a driver's license at 15 because you were needed, for harvest. You needed to drive the truck, and this is all under assault now. I mean, we have some in a sort of, regulatory. And from a regulatory point of view, there's feelings here, and I've been very educated by them in these meetings, that we may have gone too far in actually discouraging young people getting that early training and early exposure that's needed. I have to link it to this stable legal workforce issue as well. This has been, I mean, the pain, everybody in this room knows about the tragedy of crops not being harvested right now in Georgia and other states. Have we gone too far here? And it's such a politicized issue now. It's so polarizing that it's difficult. But again, this is the place AGREE has to step up, has to step in. What I would say simply, Mill, in this is that, and Dan said it earlier, go to any college campus or university campus in America. I guarantee you that the #1 issue you're going to hear on kids' minds right now, aside from jobs, is food. Where's their food coming from? What's going on in the food system? Is participation in the food? And I'm not talking about Northeast liberal arts stuff. I'm talking about land grants. I'm talking about mainstream universities around. It's created, pink slime and mad cow and all of these sort of fears sort of fan the flames. But the reality is that kids growing up now have, I grew up in the 60s when Rachel Carson had just come out, and there was a lot of sort of questioning authority in Vietnam, and the spraying over there was sort of part of my early background. But the kids today are growing up with a massive amount of insecurity, a massive amount of reasonable distrust in government and in big business, and in the status quo to really be providing for their future. We've got to we've got to marry that enthusiasm and excitement with some hope, with some incentivizing types of behaviors, whether it be in the organic space or whatever. And I think that there's tremendous opportunity here. It's not divorced from the R&D issue. You know, in my little state of New Hampshire, we've so slashed the university funding. The president there now calls it the university located in New Hampshire. I think 17% of the university's funding is now coming from the state. And yet kids are there to learn. Kids are there to learn about agriculture. Kids are there, they want to do applied research. So these are tied together, but this is obviously, at the end of the day, that's what this whole thing is about. It's about how we're going to be feeding ourselves, and it's not going to be the folks in this room, maybe a few, but it's not going to be us with gray hair. It's going to be this next group. This has to be this has to be the group on the fairway, in our cross sites, whatever you want to say, who's our principal priority. That was an easy one for this to be one of the 5 short-term priorities.
Neil, can I jump in?
Yeah,
on
I was
that?
going to ask you to.
As an economist, I think we really have to pay attention, though, to things like income. And the question is, how much income can be generated on a small farm by a starting up farmer who doesn't have huge capital assets? I mean, this is a real issue. And I visit land-grant universities on not a regular basis, but often enough. And I've found in the horticulture departments, the students are not studying how to grow better tomatoes or how to produce organic zucchini that don't have bugs on them. They're studying turf, effectively, because the jobs are out there on the golf courses. They're not there growing tomatoes.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe.
I want to be clear. I think the interest is in how we're eating, not how we're
Right.
growing, and we've got to shift it.
But that
to how we're
interest in
gonna grow.
eating has to be interest in
But good
how they can
fairways
get
are
the
important.
get the employment context going here.
Can I just say, slightly different take. Some of you know I used to be at the Motion Picture Association, the famous movie The Graduate. And Dustin Hoffman didn't know what he was going to do with his life. And all of a sudden, William Daniels, who was either his father-in-law or his uncle, he says, I got one word for you: plastics. And you all remember that. I honestly do believe there's no one miracle cure, but agriculture and food production is kind of like the plastics of the modern world. And without, hopefully, some of the environmental problems with it. But you just look at the long-term economics of agriculture. They're very, very good. And I'm not so naive to believe that what goes up can't come down. But I don't think it's going to come down as far as it once did. And I think that the economics, I see my friend Bob Thompson out there and a lot of much more brilliant economists out there than I have. But I believe that when young people are looking at this business in the future, they're looking at it a lot more optimistically than they used to. And you see it not just in farmers, you see it in restaurants and food purveyors all over the country. I mean, food has become a much more integral part of our life than it ever used to be. So all that's good. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have a problem, especially with immigrant labor as it relates to the production and harvesting of a lot of foods around the country, and we have been incapable of getting an immigration bill. And it may be that we need to stop looking at this cosmically and looking at, as Deb talks about, more sectorally, industry by industry, because, you know, the food has got to be harvested in a fair, sustainable, legitimate way. But I honestly believe that the business of agriculture is going to go through a renaissance. It's changing rather dramatically. And therefore, the opportunities are really for an awful lot more people to enter this venture in various parts. And what maybe we can do, in addition to just focusing on what the program payments ought to be for farmers, which is quite frankly what Congress has tended to do naturally over the years, is to look at these other things, whether our research base is well developed to deal with the problems of the world, where our banking system, financing system can get people into business and keeping, you know, into the business, whether the diversity of agriculture is good enough to cope with the modern changing techniques that are occurring, and a whole litany of other kinds of issues. But I wouldn't want people to believe that this is the end of the world for agriculture. Quite the contrary. I think that things long-term are very positive for this business.
Thank you, Dan.
I just
Gary
want to
had one more
quickly
thing.
add, I mean, what gives me hope every day is the 1,800 family farms who support Stonyfield. We're a $400 million company. The average herd size, most people think this is not possible, but the average herd size of these 1,800 farms is 82 cows. Young people, in terms of capital costs, these are much lower costs of entry on much smaller pieces of land. Now, of course, what does this mean? They're diversified farmers. This is a different kind of operation, but it's a place of entry. It's a place, and I can tell you, I have hundreds of examples, not tens, hundreds of examples of farmers who, when they, based on the conventional milk price over the last 20 years, were about to pack it in. When we got them converted, at $12, $13 a hundredweight, when we got them switched over, not only are they excited and making money, because these are 1,800 profitable farms, but their kids are involved. Many of them are now buying up and taking up and adding 2, 3, and 4 farms per family. By the way, that's how I'm going to grow our supply, is growing it literally within families. So there are hopeful sectors. There are hopeful. This is but one. And again, this is the kind of data and evidence sharing that I think you can get a sense of Agree taking on.
Thank you, all three, very much. I think you can get a sense that with our 5 priorities, we've got everybody on board that these are important and that we're going to wrestle with them over the next 12 to 18 months and do so with great specificity about policy and action. And this gave you a little flavor. The co-chairs are going to be back up with Deb after our advisors have a conversation on the same issues. And you can see the diversity and confluence of our great group. So thanks so much for your attention.
And get your questions ready.
Yes, and get your questions ready. They'll be, we'll have people
back.
come around and grab them from you, and then we'll be back so these guys can answer them. Thank you.
Yeah. Good.